All right, let's get right into it. The U.S. tax system has a pretty straightforward rule. If you earn money here, you've got to pay taxes. But what if you don't have a Social Security number? Well, it turns out there's a special tool made for that exact problem.
So, that's the big question, right? It's a real puzzle that millions of people have to figure out every single year. The government needed a way to process tax returns for people who have to file but just aren't eligible for an SSN. The answer? It's a simple 9-digit number that basically unlocks the door to paying your taxes.
So, here's what we're going to cover. First, we'll look at the big idea behind all this. Then we'll define exactly what an ITIN is and who uses them. We'll walk through how you get one, tackle some major myths, and finally, look at the real-world human stories behind the numbers. All right, first up, let's start with the core concept. It's a really fundamental piece of U.S. law that makes this whole system necessary in the first place. Here's the bottom line. The tax code is pretty clear. If you earn income in the United States, you're required to pay taxes on it. And that rule applies to everyone, no matter their immigration status. So you can see the dilemma, right? This created a huge need for a way to track payments from people who didn't have a Social Security number. And that brings us to the solution.
So what is this solution? Well, the official answer to our big question has a name: the Individual Taxpayer Identification Number, or as pretty much everyone calls it, the ITIN.
An ITIN is purely, and I mean purely, a tax processing number. The IRS created it back in 1996 for one simple reason: to give people a way to follow the tax laws. You can think of it like a key that only fits one lock, and that lock is the federal tax return system. And this is where it gets super clear. An ITN is not a Social Security number. It gives you zero, and I mean zero, permission to work. It gives you no eligibility for Social Security benefits later on. And a fun fact, you can always spot an ITN because it always starts with the number 9. An SSN, on the other hand, does all that other stuff. It authorizes work, it tracks your earnings for retirement. So the takeaway is crucial. They serve completely different purposes. Okay, so if it's not for work, then who exactly is using an ITIN to file their taxes? You know, the answer might actually surprise you. It's a really diverse group.
This list really shows how wide of a net the ITIN casts. You have undocumented workers for sure, but you also have people who are in the U.S. legally but just aren't eligible for a Social Security number, like some students, spouses on certain visas, and even foreign investors who own property here and need to report that income. It's a tool for a whole lot of different situations.
And the scale here is just wow. Since this whole program started back in 1996, the IRS has handed out 26 million ITINs. This isn't some small niche program. It's a major piece of how the U.S. tax system functions. Okay, so we know what it is and who uses it, but how does somebody actually get one? Let's get into the nitty-gritty of the process. The process is really specific. First, you have to fill out a form called the W-7. Now, here's the key part. You can't just send that in by itself. You have to attach a completed federal tax return to it. That's how you prove to the IRS that you actually need the number. Then comes the part that's often the biggest hurdle. You have to provide original documents, like your passport, to prove who you are. And for a lot of people, the thought of mailing their only passport is, a huge risk. Finally, you mail it all in or find a special center to apply in person. And here it is. This is the Form W-7. This is where it all begins. It's pretty straightforward. Ask for your name, address, that kind of thing. It is the official request sent to the IRS saying, hey, I need a number to pay my taxes. Okay, this next part is so important. There's a ton of confusion and, frankly, a lot of real fear surrounding the ITIN program. So let's separate the facts from the fiction. This is probably the biggest, most common misunderstanding out there. It's easy to see why someone might think a government-issued number means you have the right to work. But the reality could not be more clear. The IRS says it again and again, and ITIN has one job, and one job only, to process your federal taxes. It has absolutely, positively nothing to do with getting a job.
Now, this is the big one. This is the fear that stops a lot of people from even applying. They worry that getting an ITIN is basically just putting their name on some kind of list that'll be handed right over to immigration.
But in reality, there are some really strong privacy laws built right into the tax code. Section 6103, that's the key. It basically acts as a firewall between the IRS and other government agencies. Now, are there exceptions? Yes, but they're super narrow, like for a criminal investigation with a court order. But the IRS's default position is confidentiality. You have to remember, their main job is to collect taxes, and they know that if people are too scared to file, that job becomes impossible.
So we've covered the what and the how, but let's talk about the why. Why do people go through this complicated, sometimes scary process? What does it actually mean to them? Ernesto's story just captures it so perfectly. For him, this isn't just about paying money. It's about creating an official paper trail, a record that proves he's contributing. It's his way of saying, look, I'm here, I'm working, and I am paying my share. It's an act of compliance and maybe a hope for the future. And Alicia's story just hits you with this incredible sense of civic duty. When she found out she owed taxes, her first instinct wasn't to run and hide. It was to pay it back, because to her, that's just part of the deal. That's what citizens do. It's such a powerful statement about wanting to be part of the community, even without the official paperwork.
And that really leaves us with this final thought. You know, the ITIN program lives in this really unique space between tax law and the realities of immigration. It allows millions of people to contribute billions of dollars to the economy. But it also shines a bright light on a much bigger question about the relationship between contributing to a country and belonging to it. And that is a question that sits at the very heart of a much, much larger American conversation.